Tonight, we are honoring Black History Month, and we are thrilled to welcome our speaker, Dr. Shauna Leath, who will present findings on Black mothers' racial socialization practices with their daughters on racial violence. My name is Shiva, and I'm the chair of this committee. I'm joined today by Nida, our marketing specialist, Mina, our treasurer, our committee senior advisor, Anne, is unfortunately not with us tonight, but we have Janan, our diversity representative. Welcome, Janan.
Hello, good evening, everyone.
Excellent. So at this time, I would like to say thank you to our sponsors who have helped us to maintain this series. So I'm going to share with you the slides of our sponsors. As you see here, we have comprehensive neuropsychological services who have been sponsoring us for the third consecutive year. Thank you so much. And I'm so proud to say that I'm affiliated with this company. You also see your beautiful names at the supporters and friends level. Also, thank you to the Connecticut Health Foundation for the grant that we received from them, and thank you to Dr. Klee, who made it possible for us to improve the programming of the Social Justice Speaker Series. Now I'm going to turn it over to Mina to share with you additional information, including our speaker's biography.
On behalf of the Planning Committee, we're thrilled that you could join us this evening. We hope that you continue to attend future speaker sessions. The SJSS is in our third year of programming, and we're committed to combating racism, promoting community healing and social justice, and most notably being advocates for change. We're excited about the presentation from Dr. Shauna Leath. As a quick reminder, the CPA SJSS offers free monthly meetings to CPA members and the broader Connecticut community and our nationwide supporters. And I welcome you to our speaker series this evening. At this time, I'm going to introduce our speaker for the evening. Dr. Shauna Leath is an assistant professor in the Psychological and Brain Sciences Department at Washington University in St. Louis. She uses interdisciplinary approaches in education and psychology to understand and address issues related to the holistic development of Black girls and women in the context of families, schools, and communities. She directs the Fostering Healthy Identities and Resilience collaborative, which includes undergraduate and graduate students, as well as a range of community partners in the St. Louis area who are invested in Black women and girls' wellness. Dr. Leath has obtained external funding from organizations such as the National Science Foundation, the Spencer Foundation, the Society for Research on Child Development, and the National Center for Institutional Diversity to conduct research within Black families and communities. Here you have Dr. Leath.
Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be here today, and I appreciate being hosted. I'll be sharing a bit from one of my papers in particular, but first I'm going to just get us started by thinking about where I started with my research. So in terms of where I started, my research program in graduate school really considered variation in the identity-based experiences of Black girls and women in educational contexts, particularly how they were simultaneously hypervisible and invisible in academic settings, and how they actively constructed positive meanings around their identities. Now, initially, I had a series of papers that primarily employed survey and experimental methods, honing in on how educators tend to overlook the significance of Black women and girls' intersectional identities in relation to their treatment within schools and other settings. For instance, this first image represents the importance of communal learning for Black students, or having the opportunity to work in groups and collaborate with other students in the classroom. Now, in a set of studies with Black and white high school students, we found that regardless of communal orientation, Black students performed better on a set of math tasks when they were able to collaborate and work with others. But for white students, only those who reported a higher individual communal orientation performed better in a group learning setting. Now, in addition, I have a number of papers that set out to nuance the assumption that Black women and girls are either not at risk compared to Black men and boys, so thinking about these comparative lenses that in some ways are not useful, or that Black women and girls are only at risk by focusing on their resilience and by challenging educators and administrators to better support this population by changing educational policies and practices within school settings. Now, in addition, this work also highlighted Black women's awareness of how they are constructed by others, as well as their methods of resistance. Now, as my time in graduate school at the University of Michigan came to a close, I was sitting down with an advisor and thinking about what was next. And he posed the following question: what does it mean to be a healthy Black girl? And I couldn't answer him, right? Because health involves a multiplicity of factors and mechanisms that we have yet to really explore in strengths-based and culturally relevant ways for Black women and girls. But this question set the stage for my first few years as an assistant professor at the University of Virginia, where I continued my work on student development and launched a new line of work on family processes as the PI of the FIRE Collaborative. Again, as mentioned, amazing group of undergraduate and graduate students and community partners that span Charlottesville, Virginia, and now St. Louis, Missouri. Now, within my lab's research to date, we've really focused on how Black women and girls navigate the social norms, expectations, traditions, and beliefs within their family and school settings, and we specifically analyze how power structures and personal experiences intersect to inform identity development and how Black women and girls come to understand who they are and how they're positioned within society. So in particular, a core part of my scholarship involves challenging the epistemic erasure of Black feminist scholars, activists, and community change agents. I remind my students, both those who work in the lab and those that I teach, that in order to move the field of psychology forward, or any field for that matter, particularly in how we theorize and understand development, it's necessary to have a firm understanding of the history of theories and methodologies to see how we're contributing to some of these conversations in the work that we're doing within our own program of research. For instance, in my work, I draw on seminal theories of Black feminism and Black girlhood studies that interrogate the intersections of racism, sexism, classism, and ableism in relation to identity, development, and health. Which brings us to the title of today's talk, Mapping Misogynoir Within Developmental Discourse. So misogynoir was originally coined by Dr. Moya Bailey in 2008 within her dissertation research, and it refers to the ways in which anti-Blackness and misogyny intersect to produce racialized gendered harm against Black women and girls. Now, Bailey notes that misogynoir is a parallel concept to theories of double jeopardy, intersectionality, and gendered racism. And in an interview, Bailey stated that, "I think we have to refine language in a lot of different ways so we can actually come up with solutions that help the communities we want to address," which is critical in relation to my own scholarship. For instance, I have a number of papers that examine how misogynoir shows up within the cultural and social fabric of society. So for instance, in a paper published in Journal of Early Adolescence, we use an experimental design to examine whether the academic and social expectations of elementary school teachers might be influenced by girls' pubertal timing and race. And we found that compared to white girls, teachers had lower academic and social expectations for Black girls, especially those who looked physically or developmentally older than they were chronologically. So this notion of adultification bias, where we do not perceive Black girls as children in the same way as we do other girls of a similar age. I also have a series of papers that focus on how experiences of misogynoir directly affect Black women and girls' development, many of which focus on well-being and mental health. For instance, we found in a study of 447 Black women who were between 20 to 35 years old, so a bit of emerging and established adulthood, we looked at how experiences of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, like physical abuse and emotional neglect or substance use, and endorsement of the superwoman schema, which is a racialized and gendered schema of identity where Black women are expected to be strong, they have an obligation to help others at the expense of themselves. There's a resistance to emotional vulnerability because they'd be perceived as weak, and how the intersections of adverse childhood experiences and endorsement of the superwoman schema related to mental health outcomes. And in general, we found interaction effects, where Black women who more strongly internalized the superwoman schema and had more experiences of ACEs reported worse depressive symptomology and anxiety. So this notion of really thinking about how trauma lives in the body and also thinking about gendered and racialized trauma. And then finally, I have a number of newer papers in the lab that really think about how Black girls and the communities that care about them resist misogynoir within their everyday experiences. Now, in this stream of work, I'm primarily using qualitative research methods with the goal of creating new frameworks and theories of identity and socialization, including an operationalized measure of misogynoir. And while all of my work is exciting to me, this collection of papers on topics like how Black mothers use racial grief as a resource to affect social change, or how Black college women articulate a sense of freedom, which will be coming out hopefully soon in JDHE, has really pushed me to think deeper about how individuals resist marginalization to lead meaningful and joyful lives. And so with that, I'll turn to the topic of today's presentation, What Happens If They Come For You, an exploration of Black mothers' racial socialization on discrimination and racialized violence with their daughters, which was published in Psychology of Women Quarterly. So I started writing this paper in 2020, when, like many of us, I was sitting at home feeling immobilized. I was enraged about the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. At that time, I was terrified about COVID-19 and what that would mean for my children, my family, my friends, students, this notion of a pandemic within a pandemic, specifically for Black people in this country. And I started to read and to listen and to write, in part as a way to cope and process with many of the conversations that were happening around the country. And I learned a lot during this journey. For instance, I learned that Black women and girls as young as 7 and as old as 93 have been killed by the police, though we rarely hear their names. And so now I'm gonna switch over and have us listen to about 6 minutes of an interview between Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, who originally coined intersectionality, and Gina Best. Gina Best was India Kager's mom, and India was a Black female Navy veteran who was killed in September 2015 when she was taking her son, who was then an infant, to visit his father's side of the family in Virginia Beach. Now, her son's father had previously served time, and allegedly an anonymous tip that was called in to the officers led to a Virginia SWAT team following them around for 3 hours, collecting surveillance. That's important to note because they knew that an innocent woman and baby were in the car, but in many ways, like Breonna Taylor, they were deemed collateral damage. So I do want to mention, I'm gonna pause. I'm also gonna add the written transcript into the chat for anyone who doesn't wanna listen to the 6 minutes. And if you search for communication, you'll find the spot where I'm gonna start the recording. So just hang on with me for a second while I pause this screen share and switch over.
About the communication that you've had with the police department. What did you hear? When did you hear it? And what has your relationship been with the police?
Can you all hear it?
Yes, we can hear it. Sorry, I was
Okay,
putting my
maybe
thumbs
should-
up, but I didn't realize my camera was off.
Department that took her life since then.
All right. First of all, we were asking for the video. They wouldn't release it.
So you've still not seen the video?
Not the real authentic one, no. And I don't have India's belongings, her sketchbook, her phone.
All the things that she had with her?
Nothing. I don't have her purse. I have nothing.
And why is that? These are her personal effects. Why don't you have them?
Because the attorneys said that to give them to me now is a biohazard because of the blood. And these are my daughter's belongings. I want them, even the car, all of that. And I had been up, let me just share that night before, a mother's heart knows something's wrong when something's going on with her kids. I couldn't even sleep. So I knew something was off. And I was up at like 1:33 in the morning, finally drifted off. It's like, something doesn't feel right. It's just this strange vibe. I just felt something was wrong. Finally drifted off to sleep. It was after 3 because I remember I was gonna watch something on Netflix. And then around 7 something, India's face shows up on my phone. And I said, India? And it was Richard. And he says, Gina, India's not with us anymore. He paused, and I don't remember how I got out of my bed, but I found myself at the top of the stairs. And I screamed and screamed and screamed. And my son and my youngest daughter came out, and I was just screaming India's name. Apparently, I ran out of the car. I grabbed my purse and the keys to my car barefoot, and I ran out and jumped in my car. And I just was trying to drive to get away from what I had just heard. I was trying to get away from that. So that's how, and since then, there has been no acknowledgement by the police at all.
So
At all.
Nobody, no official ever contacted you,
No.
ever expressed their regret for taking someone's life who was innocent.
Nothing. No letter, nothing. The only thing that Jim Severa and Colin Stoley did when they put out that 6th grade level so-called report is mention that regrettably India Kager was killed in an operation. Regrettably. Still don't have India's belongings. They don't want to give me the car because it's a biohazard. That was India's car. I want to see
Where
for
is
my-
the car? Where is it?
They destroyed. They sent me a bill from the city of Virginia Beach. I'm saying,
Shut up. Are you kidding me?
no, ma'am, I'm not. They sent me a bill to pay for the
Their
removal.
destruction of the car that they murdered your daughter in.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
And I know people don't know this.
No,
They don't know
no,
it.
they don't. What came out in trial was, why did you all continue with this operation even when you recognized there was an innocent woman and an innocent baby? There was a baby in the car. That was asked.
And
They
what was
skirted
the
and dodged
answer?
around that. That they felt that what word did they use? Exigent circumstances, I'm trying to get it verbatim, warranted moving forward. Here's the problem with that. There was nothing exigent.
Only thing was exigent was they were getting hyped up and ready for their kill. And no innocent person's presence was going to change that trajectory.
And then the chief, when he made his news conference, said that the officers involved are going to need therapy because this has impacted them.
Oh my God.
But nothing mentioned of India's baby. Jim Severa mentioned that those police officers, he was concerned about the mental being of the police officers on the killing. Nothing about India, nothing about the baby, nothing about India's little sister, India's big brother, me as India's mother, nothing about our family. After murdering India, they put out on the news that to make India seem like a horrible mother, that they had to send an officer to Walmart to buy the baby bottles and diapers. She breastfed. She didn't have bottles.
An innocent woman is trailed, surveilled, and killed by a SWAT unit.
An entire lynch mob.
The story is not how outrageous is this, that this Black woman has been shot down in front of her child to boot. The story is we have to go to Walmart to get bottles. That's what people are upset about rather than the taking of her life.
Exactly. The baby, for 3 days, they wouldn't even let me know where Roman was. My grandson, they did not answer the phone calls of where Roman was. He's in the hands of strangers. I was calling, even in my messed up state, trying to find out, where's my grandson? Where's my grandson? And even in that, they refused to give me any information about where my grandbaby was. Refused.
Did
3
you know
days.
if he was hospitalized?
I didn't know if he was hospitalized. Honestly, I didn't even know if he was alive. And the only way I found that out was when they had the press conference September 8th, that the baby was placed in Child Protective Services. Now, mind you, Roman didn't even know how to drink from a bottle. Child Protective Services, and then in the hands of a foster parent. And the foster parent told me that when she got Roman, she had the hardest time. He couldn't even take sustenance from a bottle, the plastic, because he was a nurse. He was breastfed, India breastfed. Whenever I would babysit for her, it was only for a couple of hours because he would then need to be at the breast. But he had cuts on his little legs from the glass, the shatter of the glass. And he had human tissue in his hair.
Oh my God.
That she had to remove, blood on his clothes.
She lunged to protect him.
She turned, yes.
So we're in a moment now where the political cry is trust Black women. We hear that Black women are the most politically mobilized of any constituency. We hear about how Black women are holding up these movements. And then on this other hand, when it comes to India, when it comes to Corinne, when it comes to Tanisha, you know, when it comes to those of us who have been killed by the police, all that trust Black women stuff, well, I just wonder what happens to it. Where does it go? Where do you think it goes?
Thank you. Let me switch back over. Also, grab the transcripts. Let me do that and then get us forward again. Just having a few issues with all. I think I'm host on this, and so it's pulling up multiple things for me. Let me try again, because people are popping in and out of the chat. Okay. Yeah, just about there. Thank you for listening with me. Now, during our interview with Dr. Crenshaw, Gina goes on to talk about the pain from the erasure of her daughter's story, about the pain that she experienced in hearing that the officers received mental health support for the trauma of the incident, but how the family was offered nothing, and the disregard for her daughter, as well as her grandson and the family afterwards. She also named other Black women who have been killed by police, including Corinne Gaines and Tanisha Anderson, as well as Miriam Carey, although we didn't hear that part. Now, later in the podcast, which relates to the work that I'll be presenting today, Dr. Crenshaw maps misogynoir into this conversation by drawing attention to how Black women and girls are uniquely vulnerable to state-sanctioned violence, but remain under-examined in public and scholarly discourse. This image is drawn from the Say Her Name campaign, which I had on the title slide as well. A movement started through the African American Policy Forum to highlight how perpetrators of violence, including police officers, intimate partners, and educators in school settings, can get away with the victimization of Black women and girls in part because they do not often receive the same attention and activism as Black men and boys. Now, in the image, we see the names that may be very familiar to us, including Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Philando Castile, and George Floyd. And below those names, even though I know the image is small, are the names of Black women or girls who were killed in the same year or around the same time, like Shelley Frey, Michelle Cusseau, and Ayanna Stanley Jones, a 7-year-old. Now, I do not share this image again to set up a false dichotomy between Black women and men who were killed, since I find that simplistic and harmful for broader narratives about this, but instead to visually highlight how we often overlook Black women and girls in some of these conversations because we think they're racialized and gendered in particular ways. Now, in the present study, I aim to consider whether this also occurred in Black mothers' conversations with their daughters on racial discrimination and violence. Would they consider them less susceptible? And would they address racism and sexism or misogynoir in conversations with their daughters about police violence? I drew upon racial socialization literature as a departure point for this work. Racial socialization refers to the messages that parents convey to their children about the meaning of their racial group. We know that racial socialization is a key parenting practice in Black families that many parents use to help their children understand, process, and cope with discrimination. And scholars highlight the positive benefits of racial socialization. For instance, Black youth who receive more racial pride or self-worth messages evidence higher academic motivation, better psychological well-being, and increased pro-social behaviors like community service. Yet we know less about how racial socialization has shifted in response to the increased visibility of anti-Black racial violence. For example, in response to George Zimmerman murdering 17-year-old Trayvon Martin due to suspicious behavior, a 2015 study found that Black parents believed that young Black boys needed more protection and more messaging around these topics. Yet we know little about the ways in which moms contextualize and communicate knowledge on discrimination and violence with their daughters, or if the same holds true for Black fathers as well with their daughters. I also drew upon relational communication theory to frame mother's messaging. So this theory draws attention to how communication is a bidirectional and transactional process between parents and their children that includes both the intended and the received message between parents and kids. RCT acknowledges that communication involves both the explicit content of what is said, as well as particular relational context. So might certain messages from parents on racism mean more to Black youth when they happen to know someone close to their age or where they live who've experienced particular forms of violence? Does it matter if your parents are talking directly to you or if they're talking to a sibling? And then finally, relational communication theory distinguishes that family members can have different perspectives on the same event and that children's meaning making likely shifts over time. So this is important since we have fewer studies that consider emerging adulthood as a critical period of identity development and reflection in which Black women may be making new meanings on their mother's prior messages about race and racism when they're in a college setting. So the guiding research question was, what type of messages do Black women recall from their mothers on racial discrimination and And I pulled the data from my Black women socialization study, which included 50 Black women, but only 47 actually had responses from their moms. So it's 47 Black women for this paper between 18 to 24 years old who were either attending predominantly white institutions or PWIs in the Midwest or the Southeast. They were ethnically diverse and they participated in individual semi-structured interviews that lasted between 45 to 90 minutes, and they received $20 for participating. Again, in regard to thinking about development and context, here's a bit more about the women's families, the university, and current events in society during the data collection period, which spanned between 2019 to 2020. So again, their families were also nationally diverse, with a number of women from Black immigrant households where their parents had migrated from their home countries to the US. 75% were from married nuclear households with a father and a mother, and they were from a range of social class backgrounds, including working class, middle class, and poor upper class. The median income was around $80,000. Just to acknowledge that social class status, making $80,000 in Arkansas, for instance, is very different from making $80,000 in New York City. And so we just had multiple indicators for social class and socioeconomic status. I conducted these interviews with women at 2 PWIs, where the Black undergraduate student population was lower than 6%. Both had ties to gentrification and or the enslavement of African Americans in the US, as well as long legacies and histories of Black student resistance in response to racial discrimination. And finally, these women grew up within a society that devalues them for their race and gender group membership. Yet alongside Breonna Taylor and the Say Your Name movement, they had Black Girl Magic, coined in 2013 by Kashawn Thomas, as well as social and political vanguards like Black women, Cori Bush, Simone Biles, Amanda Gorman, Michelle Obama. And I want to just take a brief moment to break down the intentionality in my methodological approaches as well, given that this seminar is focusing on social justice within scientific research. So how do we come to know what we know? How do we do good science? And how do we situate social justice within the work that we do, including the papers we write, research presentations, grant writing, and beyond? So I use Black feminism and qualitative inquiry and situated Black college women as producers of knowledge. Now, my work prioritizes their perspectives as a necessary addition to developmental scholarship. And I honestly get the question quite a bit, what do Black women and girls have to tell us about human development, as though we aren't human or as though we have less to offer than, for instance, predominantly white college student samples? Now, during data collection, my team and I, also Black women, communed with the women that we talked to, sharing bits and pieces of our own stories as Black girls and as Black women in white educational settings and in the US. We held intimate understandings of the study site since we had each navigated the contours of racism and misogynoir in our own time as students and scholars at other PWIs. And in reviewing the literature, we made it a point to cite other Black feminist scholars and draw on interdisciplinary work that spanned beyond psychology. As I mentioned before, my lab and I have been using consensual qualitative research methods for many of the projects in the lab. And CQR is a well-known qualitative analysis method that includes both independent reviews of coders, as well as group dialogues about our biases, our interpretation of data, as well as multiple measures of reliability and trustworthiness, including having multiple coders on the team, having a documented exclusion criteria log for how we're making sense of the data, what we're including, what we're excluding, having an external auditor who reviewed the code book, all the excerpts, and our notes about it, as well as member checking, where we gave the final analysis and results back to the women and said, did we represent your stories in the ways that honor what you were trying to tell us? Are there any changes that you would want us to make? And we make changes. And then finally, I wanted to touch on the writing and dissemination process with this piece. So a guiding assumption in all of my work involves spotlighting the inherent dignity and cultural strengths within Black communities, even when we're talking about challenging issues like racialized violence. So in the current project, that involved making it clear that Black mothers are not responsible for racialized violence. Even as an implication section, I offered specific ways that some mothers can increase or improve the messages they provide to their daughters. In addition, I realized that a number of journals on psychology and development may not have thought the piece was a good fit. And so I had to make an explicit case in the cover files about the importance of intersectional and anti-racist feminism within scientific literature. And this type of conversation is something that I often revisit whenever my students and I are finding the right journal home for a piece. So who do we want to be in conversation with? How are we being trustworthy in how we choose to disseminate the experiences of the women and the girls and the families that participate in our studies? Finally, on to the findings. So we had 5 overarching domains about the nature of racial socialization messages that the mothers provided to their daughters. And I'm going to highlight examples from 2 of the most frequent: consistent messaging, as well as socialization messaging that focused on sons. Again, I can only present a snippet of the findings, but I'm happy to talk about any of these during the Q&A session. And I prepared examples for all of them. So for theme 1, consistent messaging, Alyssa stated, "My mom made sure to educate me on slavery. She had me watch Roots when I was little. She wanted to make sure I was educated on it, and I saw all of it. I saw them get beat, all of that, and I was probably in elementary school. I can't seem to remember us really sitting down and talking about me being a Black woman, though." Now, Alyssa's excerpt shows that the women's racial education oftentimes started early, supporting evidence again that racial socialization is a normative developmental phenomenon within Black families. Moreover, she highlighted the influence of witnessing race-related trauma within a movie in elementary school. I'm sure that's something that many of the mothers had to consider. How much do I expose my child to? How do I balance that with racial pride or other cultural heritage messages? And what is too much? Finally, her excerpt also shows that her mom didn't talk as much about being a Black woman, so a general absence of the intersections. And that was true for many of the excerpts in the sample, which I'll talk more about later. Now, while frequency counts aren't always considered useful in qualitative work, the reviewer specifically asked for it in the paper, and I did want to highlight that consistent messaging on topics related to racial discrimination and violence was the most frequent theme that we found. So these women's mothers were talking with them about race since early childhood. Now, for the second theme, the focusing on sons, Desiree said, "It was definitely more for my brother. He's darker than me, and he's a skateboarder who wears ripped jeans. Some people interpret that as dangerous, and when my mom wanted him to express himself, she also needed to tell him what to do and not to do. It helped me form my ideas about interacting with police, but it was mostly not directed at me." So 1, we see Desiree noting how physical appearance mattered for her mother's beliefs about who would be susceptible to harm in their home, noting her son wearing ripped jeans and thinking back to Trayvon Martin and wearing a hoodie and what that represented for many parents after he was murdered. She also notes that, going back to relational communication theory, that these conversations were not directed to her, but still influenced how she thought about racial discrimination and violence, how they could show up and exist in the world. And again, really having to think about the importance and the significance of mothers wanting their children to be who they are, her son being able to be a skateboarder wearing ripped jeans, but also not wanting them to be harmed. And so many of the women discussed this negotiation, again, of how they show up in society. All right. And for the examples that I'll spotlight for responses to racial discrimination and racial violence, I'm going to again review the top 2 themes: self-advocacy and getting home safe. So Jaleesa, for theme 1, the young woman described how their mothers encouraged them to stand up for themselves. And so Jaleesa said, we were in a store and some woman started following us around as if we were going to steal something. So presumptions of criminality. My mom was like, we're obviously not shopping there ever again, and we're going to write a letter to let them know that their employee is doing this. She told me to stand up to that kind of behavior. But then when I was participating in protests at my university in response to police brutality, she wanted to make sure that I wouldn't go if it was dangerous. She taught me to stand up for what's right, but really first and foremost, to look out for myself. So these excerpts describe multiple ways to engage in self-advocacy, but also be safe. And introducing this notion of risk assessment in the conversations between moms and their daughters, as well as the importance of context and how their mothers taught their daughters to approach and handle discrimination. So she had a different response, honestly, in response to her daughter participating in university protests compared to what she shared when they experienced the criminalization within the store setting. And several of our newer studies were examining the contextual factors that encourage different messages from Black parents to their children. Now, finally, in thinking about socialization, we also see the power of implicit socialization, how mothers model self-advocacy in different instances with their daughters, which is something that we also examine within the lab. And then for the second theme in responses, the women also talked about how their mothers stressed that ultimately they wanted them to get home safe. And while I'd say that was true for all mothers across the 4 themes, they provide a different message on what that should look like. So Afia said, she was like, you know they're wrong, but just try to be nice, get out of the situation, and don't really stick up for yourself or resist. Try to make sure they're treating you the way they're supposed to be, but with a subtle approach. Keep your head down and be safe. I understand that my mom wants us to be safe, but I also understand that change does not come from doing what you're supposed to do. Her excerpt highlighted the varying perspectives between mothers and daughters. Daughters also wanting to be physically safe, right? But also being invested in societal change and recognizing that oftentimes anti-Blackness is not uprooted through doing what is expected, and thinking about different forms of protest not being considered acceptable, whether that's kneeling or whether it's actually going out in the streets. Ooh, not my light going off on me. We also see this shift happening between what moms tell their daughters and what daughters were choosing for themselves. Again, thinking about emerging adulthood as a critical period. This excerpt also highlights the importance of considering socio-political context across generations. So what the moms had witnessed and been exposed to and compared to their girls. So now we're going to just transition to implications, and then I will offer time for a Q&A. Let me pause and turn this light back on. Hold on. Come on now, I'm still here. Thank you, thank you. Okay. One, I'm always inspired by the brilliance of what these women share, what the Black girls and other studies talk with us about, what Black moms and Black dads have shared in another study that we're doing specifically on misogynoir. But the paper offered a few critical points in thinking about misogynoir and Black women's development. So one, again, that discrimination is an early developmental phenomenon. And one thing that we're talking about in a class that I'm teaching now, Psycho Black Women, is about, how early is exposure to racism for Black kids, and are we having similar conversations with white children? So if it's early enough for Black children to experience racism, then it's early enough for us to be talking to kids across different racial backgrounds about how bias and discrimination operates, both in covert and very subtle ways. Another thing is that, again, we saw very few recounted socialization messages at the intersection of racism and sexism. Now, on the one hand, this may be related to how we ask questions, but on the other hand, this could be related to, again, how we racialize discrimination and violence at the hands of police and don't think about it in relation to gender. So for instance, how Sandra Bland's non-compliance and embodiment of the angry Black woman made her a more vulnerable target during her altercation with the police compared to, for instance, white women like Justine Diamond when they were also harmed by police officers, but Justine Diamond was a white woman and had particular protections related to her femininity that Sandra Bland and other Black women do not receive or have. We also saw that the accessibility of racialized violence contributed to a heightened sense of anxiety and distress for some of the moms, but oftentimes this is relegated more so to sons than in talking with their girls. Now, in reflecting on their mothers, they also highlighted how parenting is political. They discussed how they drew on their mother's socialization in times of need, like when race-related events were happening on campus, both protests, but also just discriminatory experiences that they had in residence halls or in academic settings, and how their mother's messages on racism encouraged them to see themselves as complex human beings who are impacted by, but not defined by racialized violence or anti-Blackness within broader society. I didn't necessarily present an example on anti-Black messaging from Black immigrant mothers, but we also saw important nuances within the context of mothers' differential cultural and socio-political experiences. And in terms of practical implications, we discussed the importance of families discussing misogynoir and gendered racism with their daughters early on. There's evidence to show that racial socialization does indeed differ from gendered racial socialization for Black girls, and that gendered racial socialization can be protective of positive mental health outcomes and against depression. That it's important to include conversations on self-advocacy to help maintain positive mental and emotional wellness while also balancing that with preparation for bias messages. In terms for educators and youth programming initiatives, to consider how misogynoir can manifest in various contexts. So thinking about misogynoir within dress code violations or coercive sexual contact with Black girls. I mentioned adultification earlier on in the presentation. And so we see misogynoir in many ways that are not necessarily as covert or as obviously violent as harm from police. And the importance of drawing upon a Black feminist lens within professional development trainings. And then finally, for stakeholders in criminal justice and policy networks, we discussed the importance of broadening male-dominated paradigms of criminalization and policing in many of these conversations, which folks are doing, not only with the Say Her Name campaign, but also scholars like Andrea Ritchie, who has a book on thinking about the intersections of gendered and racialized violence for women of color. And also, again, addressing the inadequate protections available to Black women and girls within policy reports. And there's been some excellent work out of the Georgetown Poverty and Law Center around dress codes and adultification. So with that, I'd like to again acknowledge the Black families and Black women who participated in our study, as well as some Black girlhood scholars who have helped me not only in this work, but in other paper projects, Dr. Lauren Mims, Misha Enos Thompson, and Tiffany Steele, as well as phenomenal mentors and collaborators who definitely offer feedback on how to push this literature and this scholarship forward, as well as acknowledging the grant funding agency. The Rachel Sage Foundation specifically funded this project around racial and social inequality. So thank you for your time and attention. And now I'm excited to hear questions or comments about this or other work that we have going on in the collaborative.
Thank you so much. Very informative talk, Dr. Leath. It seems that in the chat, Ilan, do you have any question? Feel free to ask.
Yeah, I do actually. So being in the field of clinical counseling, and being like extremely passionate about social justice and topics of feminism and Black feminism, how would you suggest bringing this topic up in a session with Black clients in a respectful and, compassionate way where you're not triggering or causing more harm than good, while still wanting to, discuss and reflect upon, how society affects you as a person because of your race and your culture and, everything that comes with that?
Thank you for that question. So one, within clinical settings, I would wonder, is it on clinicians or counselors to bring this up, or do you mean in response to someone bringing this up in a session and wanting to offer assistance around that?
I think from my own experiences and everything, I think it would be more beneficial and appropriate to let the individual bring that up and not you imposing that on them.
Exactly. Okay, so I wanted to clarify that as a starting point. So I said I wouldn't necessarily recommend that a clinician comes in and says, so let's talk about I'm not forgetting Tyree Nichols, who just got shut down. How is that affecting you, right? That is not how we want to necessarily enter a counseling session, even though that might in fact be true. Dr. Martinique Jones has some great work. She does work around the strong Black woman schema, but also around individual therapy and group therapy. And she is a clinical psychologist down at the University of North Texas. And part of what she offers that I want to respond to what you're saying is, one, when clinicians are racially, are responsive to racial trauma that is happening, being able to validate the fact that it is real, so clients do not have to, one, feel the need to prove their existence, prove that this is in fact a traumatic experience, prove that it is increasing their stress and anxiety, in particular ways. So one is just, I would say, for counselors to have knowledge around these topics. Two, I think being able to, it's similar to some of the framing that I tried to do at the beginning of the presentations, where I said, I'm going to talk about Black moms and what their messaging is, but I want to make it clear that Black mothers are not, in fact, responsible for racialized violence. I know that some of the clinicians I've talked to have said, even as we offer coping toolkits and coping skills for clients who come in and who are troubled by this, one of the important messages beyond that is that these are skills to have individually to help lessen or mitigate the stress you experience in your body, while we are also working for social change. And so I think that framing is also very important. And when I was mentioning Dr. Jones as well around the strong Black woman schema or the superwoman schema, she talks about with clients about the expectations for Black women to be strong and historically where that comes from, but how that still shows up as stress in our bodies. And so the importance of understanding history, what that means for women and clients that she sees now, as she's also encouraging them to be able to move towards notions of strength and vulnerability that actually support wellness. And I would imagine some of the same things would be relevant in some of these conversations where that we are having.
Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Thank you for your question, Ilan, and thank you for your response. Very beneficial. Any other question?
I do have one question that I'm curious about, and you may not have the answer for this, but were there any differences between those individuals whose families have been here for longer compared to some of like the immigrant African-American families? And were the conversations any different? The reason why I'm asking is I have done research with refugees and specifically Somalian refugees. And I know 5 or 6 years ago, there were conversations between me and some of the adolescents about these topics that their parents never really discussed prior to coming to the US. And so I was just very curious to know, oh, okay, so you do have some information. So I'll let you kind of talk about it.
This was actually one of the more difficult conversations in coding, because what does it mean to talk about anti-Blackness from within a community that, again, would also experience the similar types of state-sanctioned violence at the hands of police? And how do we honor these narratives in ways that do not do more harm or contribute to things like, oh, Black on Black crime or Black on Black violence, et cetera, right? And so this example is from Athea, and she was talking about, she's Eritrean, and so she said that oftentimes growing up, they would receive messages that like, oh, those Black people, referring to African Americans, and those Black people are criminal, or those Black people aren't like working hard in school. And she actually talks about how, her mom in this case visited a lynching museum in Alabama, and her being shocked, right? And the longer that they were in the US, they had a different racialized understanding of how it operates here, which was different than in their home country. And again, thinking about, there's some work by George Mwangi thinking about Black immigrant experiences and how during this emerging adult period where there can be some shifts in how younger Black immigrants think compared to their parents, they might receive certain types of socialization, again, that the backdrop is really like Eurocentrism and white supremacy, right? It's like different racially minoritized communities trying to make sense of what it means to live in this society and to be marginalized. And how do we get resources, access safety for our children, for our families, right? Be able to live a good life. And for some of the Black immigrant families who have been here not as long, some of that involved adopting at least some anti-Black messaging with their daughters earlier on when they might not have had the same understanding or was not the same thing for them. So we did see that. Only 7 women talked about it. We had about, out of the 50 women, 26 women were from either Black immigrant families, and they were generally second generation. And so they were US citizens. Their parents had migrated over, but they had been born here. And so also their racial understandings were very much situated within a US domestic kind of context, even though some of them had spent like summers or other time over in their parents' country of origin. So yeah, that did come up. And it came up again, like, as we were talking about how do we represent these findings without pushing a narrative that we don't want to. And also it was great to see them, really wrestling with understanding where their parents were coming from, and also understanding that in many ways they were being homogenized within this country, that it was like Black or white, that we tend to have very overly simplistic understandings of race as social constructs in this country. And so their parents were also frustrated with that. And also wanting their children to be safe when they came over here and see how African Americans are being treated and harmed, right? So how can I protect my children? How can we set up this notion of difference to where you will not experience this type of harm when I send you out in the world? And it's hard, difficult. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, no, I was just really interested because I know when I had conversations with some of the adolescents, they were talking about how they don't feel like they're African American.
Mhm.
They feel as though they're African because they came
are.
here from refugee camps, but then they also at the same time realized that people saw them as African American. And so we had discussions about like people are viewing me in that way.
Yeah.
And where do I fit in while I'm developing? And so I had moved since then. I was just curious. I wish I could have stayed to kind of see how that unfolded. It would have been really interesting. But
I think
good to know
it's
that
really,
you did see some of that.
we did. And actually in a more recent paper, what's been interesting too is like, what are we imposing on some of these identifications? For instance, there were students who identified as African American, but then they were born in Nigeria or they were born in other countries. And so we were like, oh no, you're not African American, you're XYZ. And we were like, and when they would talk about their cultural or socialization, there would be nuances that we wanted to be able to highlight, but they indeed put down African American. And so I wonder if that also speaks to what some of you were saying about the Somalians, where it's like, oh, I'm being read as African American, but what does that mean when in fact I am from a different country? Yeah. Again, we just need more nuanced and complicated understandings of how we talk about race and ethnicity and understand that to be varied within Black communities. And we're getting there. There are some great scholars doing that work.
Yeah.
I see a hand, I think, Jessica.
Jessica?
Hi, yeah, no, this was great. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing. And I have a little bit of a question just in terms of some of the politicization that's been happening in the news about AP classwork in African American history. And I'm just curious how you think like the work that you're finding that you're doing might intersect with there just being much more breadth of historical information that could be shared with students, not just at an AP level, but throughout curriculums across the United States, and just the lack of just general history that people have about so many things right now. So I don't know if that's a very clear question, but it just, what you were talking about made me think about it, and just being hopeful that there's more realistic history being shared everywhere. But so that's,
it's so interesting. I had a student, there's two things I'll offer in that response before we finish tonight. So one, I had a student they had to do reading reflections in the class, right? And he had a low reading reflection. And he said, is it just because you don't agree with what I'm saying? And I said, actually, no, it is based on X, Y, and Z from the rubric. But the interesting thing is, I don't understand if he thought his disagreement would be rooted in this notion that like racism doesn't exist. And I'm like, we have scientific evidence. So it's also interesting that he thought that that was up for discussion or debate, which is getting to the point where you're saying, thinking about what is accurate in history. These things happen. And so what is the importance of teaching them? To the point of also within these findings in particular, some of what we found is that when we don't offer language, or folks will not have the language earlier on. So these girls, a lot of them were not thinking about their experiences, as I offered about Sandra Bland, as both gendered and racialized. They were thinking about it in racialized ways. And in college, they were just beginning to say like, oh, these intersections matter. And so perhaps having some of that language and history and knowledge earlier might have been useful. Maybe we're all not going to get it. I didn't learn about Black feminism or even start reading some of the Black feminist scholars that I'm very well acquainted with now until college. But what might it mean for that to come earlier? I know that AP African American history curriculum, it looks phenomenal. I was not exposed to anything like that in AP or otherwise, even going to predominantly Black schools in the South. So I think even in thinking about Nicole Hannah Jones, the 1619 Project, where she says, this isn't the only origin story. part of the importance of this work is introducing the notion that there are different origin stories. So can we talk more about Indigenous peoples, and can we introduce more to having one set narrative about this country and this people and the people in this country, because we know that that's not accurate. So those are a few of my thoughts around that, which hopefully kind of gets a bit of what you were asking or offering.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Is it?
Yes, please, Dr. Jan.
You're muted.
I appreciate the work that you've done, and I guess I'm struck by the fact that here I am, a Black mother, and as you were talking about the focus of Black mothers with their sons and daughters, I had to spend quite a bit of time with my sons talking about violence and safety. When friends who were white mothers did not spend time talking with their sons about safety and protection and violence in the way that I did. And I just, I think that parenting looks different for Black mothers. And you've emphasized a lot of that in your presentation. But I think people don't really realize how much time has to go into that, because my son is 38 years old and he was racially profiled several times, even at a mall, at a public place, and came home traumatized by that. So having had a talk with him about what to do in those situations, he was prepared to address it, but it still didn't keep him from being traumatized. So I just wanted to share that, in that your work highlights this. And I think people aren't fully aware of the parenting that has to take place from a Black mother when violence and trauma is a part of the history and the culture.
Yes. I appreciate you sharing that. There's a couple of things I want to say there, and then I know we're at time. There's a beautiful book by Danny McClain. It's We Live for the We, and it talks about the political power of Black motherhood. The other part of that is thinking about the additional emotional and intellectual labor that Black moms and Black caregivers go through to try to prepare their children for a society that, as Audre Lorde said, wants to eat them alive, that it is a dragon, right? What does that mean? In the paper that I briefly mentioned about racial grief, the moms were talking about this notion of anticipatory grief, that something could happen. Nothing had happened necessarily to their children. Their children had not actually been killed, right, by officers at the time. But the stress that came from the notion that they are more vulnerable to it, also taking a toll on their mental health. And what did that look like for them, right? And so really thinking about how racial trauma can manifest in different ways and what folks are carrying. So yes, that is true. And I'm glad that your son has been safe and that you all were able to have those conversations, but also it's terrible, right? And I think, there was a point, again, that I tried to make around this, when the moms, and I think as parents in general, we want our kids to be aware of things, but to realize that discrimination and violence is not nearly the totality of who they are or what their culture is or the love that they are surrounded by. And so again, not wanting them to be defined by the harm that could happen. How limiting is that? How limiting?
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me this evening.
Thank you so much. We enjoyed a lot, and it was a lot of information. And also, thank you for all of you who shared and who you asked questions. So Nida, would you like to do the
Of course.
closing?
Before I do, I just want to say this was phenomenal. And one thing that this made me think about just for possible future research is thinking about conversations like this with maybe close family friends that may not be African American or Black, right? Who care, and those conversations and what happened and how do they respond? Because I know I have some family members of mine who are very close with others who are African American, and we've had conversations, and there have been times where I've had to intervene with my mom and be like, well, there is a line where we have to step back, right? Because we don't have that lived experience. And so it'll be interesting to see what those experiences are like, if they've ever encountered it, in terms of how it is received and how do they respond if they possibly don't fully feel as though it's as genuine as it should be coming from someone they've been reared with. But anyway, I know we're close to time, but thank you so much. This is wonderful. So thank you all for joining us this evening. Our next social justice event will be in March. You will receive emails regarding this. I want to end by mentioning that our ability to maintain the social justice speaker series is through fundraising, and we greatly appreciate all donations moving forward. If you are able to support, the donation mailing address is in the chat. I also would like to invite you to complete our evaluation link, which is now being added to the chat. Your responses will help us improve future sessions. Thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next month.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.